The neon lights of Chicago's South Side flickered, reflecting off the damp pavement, but inside a cramped community office, a young man was busy drafting a blueprint for a future that seemed, by all statistical accounts, impossible. He was a man with a name that sounded like a question, a heritage that spanned continents, and a voice that possessed the uncanny ability to weave the fragmented threads of the American dream into a single, cohesive tapestry. Barack Obama was not merely a politician. He was an improbable intersection of history, hope, and the relentless pursuit of an ideal that was often messy, frequently obstructed, but ultimately enduring. To understand the trajectory that led from the classrooms of the University of Chicago to the rarefied air of the Oval Office, one must first understand the grit born of obscurity. Long before the global stage, he was an organizer, a man who spent his days listening to the grievances of those whom the system had deemed invisible. He learned early that politics was not about the grand gestures made in marble halls. It was about the quiet, agonizing work of getting people to see themselves in one another. When he arrived in the Illinois State Senate, and later, the U.S. Senate, he brought with him that same measured cadence, a deliberate, almost professorial style that stood in stark contrast to the performative shouting matches that defined the political landscape. The rise was swift, yet it felt like a lifetime in the making. The 2004 Democratic National Convention speech was the lightning strike that changed everything. As he took the podium, a relatively unknown state senator, he uttered words that would define his political identity. "There is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America." It was an audacious claim in a nation rapidly fracturing along ideological lines. That speech was his announcement to the world that he was not just another ambitious lawyer, he was a BR. He was a bridge builder, a man who saw the American experience as a continuum rather than a battlefield. When he ascended to the presidency in 2009, he stepped into a maelstrom. The global economy was teetering on the edge of a precipice, the automobile industry was gasping for air, and two wars were grinding on without a clear resolution. His early days were a blur of high-stakes legislative maneuvering, most notably the grueling, deeply divisive, yet transformative battle for the Affordable Care Act. It was a victory won by the narrowest of margins, a testament to his belief that government, for all its imperfections, could be an engine for fundamental human dignity. Yet, his presidency was rarely defined by easy victories. It was a tenure marked by a relentless, grinding pressure. He navigated the complexities of race in America, a subject that shadowed his every move, with a mixture of caution and calculated courage. Whether dealing with the aftermath of the Arab Spring, the hunt for Osama bin Laden, or the slow, steady recovery of a battered economy, Obama maintained a temperament that became his hallmark, the no drama approach. Critics viewed it as detachment. Supporters saw it as the necessary calm of a captain steering a ship through a permanent storm. Behind the scenes, the man was just as complex as the figurehead. Friends and aides described a man who would sit up late into the night, annotating briefing papers with blue ink, obsessed with the details of policy while holding onto a deep, philosophical skepticism about the permanence of any political achievement. He was a creature of paradox, a man who loved the intellectual rigor of constitutional law, but was constantly forced to compromise with the blunt, often cynical realities of power. As the years passed, the idealism of his initial campaign inevitably softened, tempered by the bruising realities of a polarized legislative body and an increasingly fractured digital information space. He weathered the storms of midterm elections, the rise of intense partisan vitriol, and the persistent challenge of defining a legacy in a country that was rapidly changing its own demographic and cultural identity. The end of his presidency did not mark a departure from the fray, but rather a transition to a different kind of influence. He became the elder statesman, a voice analyzing the very foundations of democracy that he had spent 8 years defending. Through his writing and his foundation, he shifted his focus from the mechanics of law to the architecture of society itself. His story is ultimately a uniquely American one, not because of where he ended up, but because of how he began, a man of humble origins who insisted that the American story was not finished, that it was a work in progress, and that every generation held the pen. He was a figure who stood against the tide of cynicism, insisting that empathy was not a weakness, that nuance was not a surrender, and that even in the most divided times, the act of listening to one another remains the most radical, most necessary form of patriotism. He remains a symbol of the tension between what we are and what we aspire to be, a testament to the belief that even the most improbable dreams can be woven into the fabric of reality if one is willing to do the work, one word, one step, and one compromise at a time. The story of Barack Obama's life is perhaps best understood not as a destination reached, but as a long, winding ascent toward a more perfect union. Even after he left the White House, the resonance of his journey continued to settle into the collective consciousness of the nation, much like the final, grounding chapters of a book that refused to stay closed. In the quiet of his post-presidency life, the man who had commanded the world's most powerful military found himself navigating the smaller, yet equally profound, challenges of private life. He transitioned from the relentless pace of a global leader to the reflective life of an author and elder statesman. For the millions who had watched him navigate the storm, his transition served as a mirror for the nation itself. A moment to pause, to look back at the jagged peaks of his administration, and to consider what had been built and what had been left unfinished. The narrative of his life remains a foundational American text because it reflects our own internal contradictions. He was the child of a white mother from Kansas and a black father from Kenya, a man who had to navigate multiple worlds before he could ever hope to lead one. This inherent duality shaped his governing philosophy. He was a firm believer in the power of systems, yet he was deeply skeptical of how those systems often failed the very people they were designed to protect. His political legacy is not contained solely in the bills he signed or the executive orders he crafted. It is found in the way he fundamentally altered the tone of American political discourse. In an era that demanded simplicity, he offered complexity. In an era that rewarded reaction, he insisted on deliberation. Whether one views his presidency as a triumph of progress or a cautionary tale of idealism meeting the harsh realities of partisan paralysis, one cannot deny that the landscape of American life was irrevocably shifted during his time in office. As he walked away from the public stage, he left behind a generation that had been mobilized by his voice, a generation that learned to view their citizenship not as a passive state, but as an active, daily responsibility. His story serves as a reminder that the American dream is not a static prize to be won, but a dynamic, evolving commitment to a set of principles that require constant, exhausting, and beautiful attention. Ultimately, Barack Obama's story is a testament to the idea that the arc of the moral universe does not bend toward justice on its own. It requires the weight of ordinary people pulling it, inch by inch, through the friction of history. He was the man who held the pen for 8 years, but he was always the first to point out that the story belongs to everyone else. The final chapter of his life is not yet written, just as the story of the nation he led continues to unfold, written in the voices, the ballots, and the quiet struggles of those who still believe that, despite the odds, a better world is possible. The story of Barack Obama is not a finished sentence. It is an ongoing argument with history. Even as the decades roll forward, the shadow he cast, and the light he sought, remains a fixed point in the American firmament. His life, from the dusty archives of Harvard Law Review to the weight of the Situation Room, acts as a blueprint for the modern leader navigating a world that refuses to stand still. His later years have been defined by a conscious effort to mentor, to teach, and to warn. He has become a custodian of the democratic process, acutely aware of how quickly the norms he once upheld can be eroded by the tides of populism and digital tribalism. He speaks less of hope, the buoyant, untethered optimism of his 2008 campaign, and more of resilience. It is the wisdom of a man who knows that building a foundation is only half the battle. The rest is spent defending it against the elements. This phase of his life is perhaps his most introspective. In the silence that followed the roar of the presidency, he has wrestled with the limitations of the office itself. He has spoken candidly about the frustration of incremental change in a system designed for gridlock, and the realization that the presidency is not a magic wand, but a slow, cumbersome lever that only moves when the citizenry provides the force. Yet, there is a distinct irony in his legacy. The man who campaigned on the idea of transcending the red and blue divide often found that his very presence seemed to clarify it. He became a Rorschach test for the American psyche, to some, a symbol of long overdue progress and intellectual integrity, to others, an emblem of a cultural shift they struggled to comprehend. This friction, rather than diminishing his impact, is exactly what makes his story enduring. It captures the essential, painful, and beautiful struggle of a multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy trying to define itself in the 21st century. As he continues to observe the unfolding drama of the nation he once led, his voice remains a steady, if occasional, resonance. He has traded the immediate power of the executive for the enduring power of the narrative. He understands that while policies are repealed and laws are amended, the story of who we are, and who we are capable of becoming, is what truly shapes the destiny of a people. Ultimately, the life of Barack Obama teaches us that the highest form of leadership is not the exercise of power, but the ability to inspire a sense of collective purpose. He was an accidental icon who became a deliberate statesman, leaving behind a map for those who still dare to believe that progress is possible, provided they are willing to endure the long, winding, and often lonely climb toward a more perfect union. The story ends where it began, with the belief that the future is not something that happens to us, but something we create together.